Good morning and welcome to Creative Collaboration with Frances Dredge. Creative Collaboration is brought to you by FEU Training, which is in itself a creative collaboration with the four unions, Equity, Musicians Unions, the Writers Guild and the NUJ. And in addition to these webinars, we do live workshops and we do e-courses, which you can dip in and out of, and we have loads of other resources on the website. So do check it out. It's a very rich source of information, which many folk find very useful. But today on Creative Collaboration, we're going to be looking at what sort of things you need to consider before you approach potential collaborators, and indeed when they approach you. What kind of things you have to bear in mind to make sure it's going to be workable and useful to you, because a collaboration should be of more benefit than not collaborating. So we're going to be looking a lot at that. How to plan your collaboration, how to make sure it works. We're going to be looking at gaining agreement in writing, actually looking at how do you formalize this in a way that actually helps and not hinders. And then, of course, Frances is going to share loads of tips for creating a strong and effective working relationship. So on that note, I will hand over to Frances.
Great, thank you, Muriel, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. So I don't know if you've collaborated before. I've actually had many successful collaborations, but they can be an absolute joy, and it's wonderful. It's for a freelance, especially if you work on your own quite a lot. It's really wonderful to work with other good people and to get the results you want. But sometimes, it can be a double-edged sword. There can be many pitfalls, and Unfortunately, I have heard some horror stories of when it all went horribly wrong, unfortunately, and it didn't work out, and people have come away, feeling ripped off or unsatisfied, or actually have lost colleagues or friends through it. So what I want to do today really is look at some sort of advice for you through my experience and also the experience of other people that I've picked up, sort of along the way, to sort of make those collaborations, to make working with other people a real success and hopefully joyful, as well as sort of producing great results. And a lot of this will become effective if you plan properly. So I'm going to look at first a few sort of things to consider beforehand, before you even start collaborating with somebody. What we don't want to do is jump in sort of into the deep end without considering anything, and halfway through realizing you've made a big mistake and you can't work with these people. So the first thing I would think, even before you approach people to collaborate, is to consider why you want to have this working relationship with one or more people. It might be, for example, that you haven't got the necessary experience or expertise to complete an idea or to a project that you've got in mind. So maybe you're a writer, you're writing a children's book, and you want illustrations of that book. So you want to work with an illustrator to get the result that you want. It might be that you need to achieve your goals more quickly. As freelancers, a lot of us have got several different jobs on the go, and working with others can help us, sort of make more time for ourselves, but also, to get our results faster. So that might be a good reason for you to collaborate with other people. Input from others often improves quality. Maybe we are good at many things, but we actually need to work with other people to sharpen that quality and to produce the best product or piece of work we can for any given client. And also, what I find about collaboration, it does, when you're working with fantastic people, it does raise your game. It's very motivational. It can be very inspiring, and also it can be great fun. Sometimes we have to work alone in the creative process, but sometimes it really is a joy to be able to work with others. So these are sort of things you need to consider beforehand, before you might have an idea, but think about these things first. Why? And also at this stage, you can think about, how do you see this collaboration structure as such? If it's your idea, maybe you're thinking, well, I'm going to lead this project. It's going to be me who's just sort of making most of the decisions. Or you might think, well, I think it's going to be more that everybody has an equal say in this. And in a collaboration, I always think that everybody does have a say, but sometimes you do have, a decision maker as such. It might be that you haven't got that far yet, and you really do need to talk to the people you have in mind first, to talk it through, to see how you're going to work this. But if you can have a clear idea in your own mind and be flexible with that, at least you're giving yourself something to work with. And also, as Mira was saying earlier on, it's not all about you're not always showing the initiative and approaching other people. Hopefully, other people will be approaching you too. So you have to think about, how you're going to work with them. For example, if you're quite a directorial person who's used to showing the initiative, who's used to leading the way, but somebody else is suggesting that they lead a project, then do you really want to get into that working relationship? We have to know ourselves to see if we can work with other people successfully. So after sort of this thought process, you might then think, well, is it collaboration that I really have in mind? So it might be that actually you don't want to collaborate with people. You actually want to be the person who's commissioning somebody else for their skills. So, for example, perhaps you're writing a big company brochure for an organization. You're going to do all the editorial work. Maybe you need a sub-editor to proof that work. You think it's going to take a morning, so you commission them. Basically, you're commissioning them for a piece of work. It's not a collaboration. You're in charge of this. And you might think, actually, that's the best way to go. Because if you are going to collaborate, it's meant to add some sort of value. It's not meant to be done just for the sake of it. It's superficially, it seems like a good idea. Think it through. Think of the reasons, what it's going to do for you and the other people involved. To collaborate and to work together, what skills they bring, and that sort of thing. So if you decide that it's the sort of thing that you want to do, the next thing really is to think about who you're choosing to collaborate with. And this also goes for if they're approaching you, because people might have good ideas, but you really do have to think about, if you can beforehand, if you can really work with that person. Now, lots of these things are discovered within the process. Somebody might seem, sort of sound and excellent at a cursory glance, but when you work with them, you actually find, maybe for not even for what they do, but maybe you just can't work together properly. Some of it, you have to discover within the process. But what I'm suggesting here is the more work you can do, the more consideration and work you can do beforehand, the better you're going to set yourself up to be working with the right people. Just a little note here is that we often get these ideas when we're sitting in, sort of having a beer with somebody. Wouldn't it be a great idea to do this? Maybe close colleagues or friends. Now, while socializing with people and having sort of brief chats with people seems lovely, seems like a good idea, friends are not always the best people to work with. So, bear in mind that this is going to be a professional relationship where you are going to be wanting to achieve important results. And sometimes, you can't be honest with friends because you have a different relationship with them. Bear in mind, that you have to make impersonal decisions. You might have to say to somebody, I don't think you're pulling your weight, and these are the reasons why. Now, can you do this with a friend? I personally, I've got some fantastic friends, but I wouldn't want to work with them because we just have very different working styles. Maybe they're a little more tardy than I am. Maybe they, sort of a little less organized, and maybe I'm a little not quite their personality type to work with as a professional. Now, it doesn't mean that along the way you don't make great friends and you can't work with them. I think in every position I've held, I've always come out with somebody who I socialize with and really admire. But just be aware of that it's not always the best decision to work with people that you really like, because on a friendship basis, because you do have to be able to do things like work through controversy. In every project there will be disagreement, healthy disagreement a lot of the time, because with disagreement comes new ideas. But sometimes you can't do that unless it's really on a professional basis. So just to bear that in mind. Don't not do it, but sort of think about what you'll have to do as part of your professional relationship. Just moving on to, whoops. And then another sort of good idea really is to consider what people have done in the past. Sort of if, who they worked with before, have they collaborated before, do they have a good reputation? Those sort of things are important. If you were going to an organization, they would ask for your CV, they would ask all these things about you. And it's just, if we're thinking that this is a professional relationship, it's just the same here, that we want to know a little bit about somebody before we actually start working with them, because people can say things, but can they actually deliver? And that's really important in a relationship. If you find the people are all talk and no action halfway through the project, then you're in a position where you may have to sort of do the work yourself, and you're probably going to be pretty resentful about that. So it's always wise, just to check up and see if people are who they say they are. You probably know them already. Actually, that's where you're thinking of approaching them. But it's no harm in seeing, what sort of things they've done before, because some people can be brilliant on an individual basis, but collaboration is about working with people. And while many people, can deliver results individually, they may be not so good when they're working in a group, because perhaps they just can't let go of an idea. Perhaps they're not such, sort of not able to involve everybody in what's happening. So those are the sort of things to consider, and consider that, sort of, you want a relationship that is built on trust and respect, and that you can continue and make sure that you get the results you want through all the challenges that you're probably going to face. Most things are quite, can be quite difficult to get off the ground. There's lots of joys along the way, but you will face challenges. So you need people who you can work through those challenges with. If you can put the planning in first, this is going to be invaluable when you actually start work. So the first thing to do when you're sitting down with one or more people, whoever you've decided are going to be in this collaboration group, is to look at your objectives, discuss your objectives, and flesh them out to make sure that you're all sort of singing from the same hymn sheet. You all have a clear vision of what's going to be happening and what you want to achieve. Now, they don't work themselves out objectives. The more you can, the clearer you can be at the start of a particular idea or project, the better you're going to be able to achieve this. If you look at them, sort of brainstorm them, look at them. So, so you really know what you're about to be going to doing, and make sure that people at this stage, make sure that everybody is passionate about what's going to be happening, because you can tell early on if people are starting to drag their feet already, then maybe they're not the best people to work with, because if you have an idea, it's very likely that you're going to be incredibly passionate about it. So you want everybody to be, sort of playing sort of in a similar sort of motivation type mode. So if they're starting to drag their feet at this stage, maybe they're not going to be the best person to work with. So once you've got your objectives, you're clear of what you're going to do. Maybe you're going to be writing and producing a play. Maybe you're going to be writing a book together, whatever it may be. Then you can really sort of start getting into the nitty-gritty of things and start planning your activities, which are going to help you achieve your overall goal. Now, your activities here will be split into two sets, really. Your creative activities, and often in a group, these will be obvious who's going to do what, but maybe not so obvious. And I'll talk about a little bit about this later on. But if you're, you know exactly what's going to happen when, that's going to help you in the project. And then in what sequence these are going to happen, what needs to be done first. So you've got a really good idea of those creative activities that are going to help you reach that goal. And then what sort of support activities are going to happen, because, we have sort of certain things we want to achieve, but usually that does take things like admin, marketing, selling that idea. So who's going to be pitching for work? Who's that for that work? Is it going to be all of you? Is it going to be one of you? Who's the best at that sort of thing? Who's going to be doing the marketing things? Like, do you have a sort of social media whiz kid on the team, or are you all going to be involved in that? Because what people often don't realize is that these things take a lot of time, and somebody's got to do them. Otherwise, you're going to be not going to be maximizing that potential of getting that idea off the ground. So if you can discuss this beforehand, of course, things will become apparent throughout the project. But if you're going to discuss these, if you can discuss these things beforehand, you'll get a really clear picture of what needs to happen and when. So once you know the activities, then you can think about the roles and responsibilities. Who is going to be doing what? Now, I suppose in a band, if you've got like a singer and a guitarist and a drummer, then those roles and responsibilities seem pretty obvious. But sometimes they can be a little more complicated. Sometimes they can overlap, but everybody needs to be sure of what they're actually going to be doing, so they then can be accountable for it. So if I'm doing the writing and you're doing the editing, then I've said to you that I'm going to be finished this piece of writing by next Wednesday, then my editor, as such, my collaborator, knows that on Thursday they need to take a day off to edit it. So basically we know what we're doing and we're accountable for that. Otherwise, people assume things that I haven't done it because I thought you were doing it. So try and make it as clear as possible. And then how to divvy up those tasks, sort of, are there creative tasks that can be divvied up fairly and evenly, or does one person necessarily have to be doing one thing? And also, sort of the things like the support tasks, like the marketing and the social media, then think about those as well, because they do take time, and who's going to be doing those, because they will be an important part of promoting your project, selling your project, etc. So also, just to make sure that, as I've mentioned, there will probably be a bit of controversy at some point or another. There will be disagreement as well as lots of agreement, we hope. So it's important to think about, so the different areas of the project and who's going to be making the decision in each area. Because if two people don't agree, then how are you going to move on? How are you going to achieve that ultimate goal? So there has to come a time where somebody makes a decision and says, this is the way we're going to do it. This is the way we're going to move forward. So if you can designate that beforehand, then you don't get the problems of arguments throughout the project and people getting unhappy and holding on to, sort of bad feelings, etc., etc. So once the decision maker has been sort of named, then at least you know who's responsible for what. Also important to consider is, who else is involved. Okay, you've got your group of collaborators as such, one or maybe many more people, but will there be other people that are going to be necessary for you to complete this piece of work? So perhaps if you're writing a book and you're interviewing lots of people, what is the stakeholder holding of those people? Do you have to get those interviews approved? Or are they going to be, sort of your autonomous piece of work? It's really good to get this sorted out beforehand, because what you don't want is if you've got contributors, them saying, I now need control in this project, when you don't want them to have control. So those sort of things, so if you can think of who else would be possibly involved and what contribution and control they're going to have, that's going to help you as well move through the project very smoothly, rather than having to stop to sort of renegotiate with people, to argue with people, or to have to do something that you didn't really want to do originally. So this sort of clear thought process is really going to help you through the actual process, if that makes sense. I hope it does.
There was a comment by Mark where he said he uses the term MLKT, meet like no trust, and so in that order to sort of learn to trust and engage with somebody, or decide not to. There was somebody asked, Sam asked, what do you mean by creative activities? They weren't quite clear on that.
Yes, Sam, thanks for the question. Well, it's things like, sort of, I always look at projects as split into two sets of the actual creative activity. So, so if I'm writing a book, the creative activity would be the actual writing and the editing and the sub-editing, and then possibly the production, the design, maybe of the cover, etc. Whereas, so that's, the creative part of it. But there's usually, and if we're collaborating, we have to designate those activities, because sometimes there's quite a lot of them. And also sometimes, people see themselves possibly as the main writer, and some people also see themselves as the main writer, or whatever it may be. So there's those activities. And then you've got the support activities, things like what you have to do to get that to market as such, so what do you have to do to get that play produced and to be shown in the theatre? So what do you have to do to promote a piece of work, or to promote a band, for example? Are you going to do a lot of social media? So there's those things to bear in mind as you go along. So I always sort of look at it in sort of two sets as such, if that answers your question. Any other questions, Muriel?
Well, there are questions that we often get asked, actually, that I thought I would just put one in. When you were talking about checking up on people, I know I've often been asked, is that not a bit intrusive? And how do you even do that?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. But I think what we have to bear in mind here, this is a professional relationship. So What I always do, is even if I sort of vaguely know somebody or think that they're good, I'll probably have a look at their website or whatever, and just suss out some of the things they've done, just to see if there's a sort of person I could work with, and also to see what they've done, because we can all say we've done things, but then I will just ask people directly. I'll offer something about myself first, and as part of getting to know them, say, oh, I've got this great idea. I'd love to work together if it's possible, and if we both are on the same page. I've sort of done a few things like this before. I've collaborated before. Well, what about you? So it's not like some sort of like Inspector Clouseau. I don't trust you. I'm like I'm going to make sure that I've lifted every sort of curtain and cover just to make sure that you're an okay person. It's more of a matter of a professional thing, as we all do. If I'm going to work for a client, they always ask about my CV, what I've done before. So it's just the same. It's just trying to take this approach where you're covering all bases and everybody knows each other, basically, and it knows what we've done. So we're comfortable with each other, and we're comfortable that we will be able to deliver what we say we can deliver. So I think that's fairly reasonable.
Yeah. There was another one, as Sharon has said, on one issue that she's had in collaboration is where she inadvertently upset the people she's collaborating with by using a style that they found too harsh, and she was mortified as she didn't realise that was happening. She uses that style with other people without any problem. And how can we best sound out others' sensitivities to communication styles?
Yeah, that can be quite difficult, actually, especially if people don't say that they're sensitive until it all sort of blows up. I'm going to sort of cover a bit of this in the last sort of section. But really, it's about sort of just checking with people. Are you okay with this? Did that go well for you? Is everybody happy? And I'll talk about this, as I say, a bit later in our sort of developing good working relationships, because there is an art to it. And it's usually based on facts rather than assumptions. But sometimes that can happen. And if people don't say, it's sometimes very hard to make them say until eventually it blows up. But you can, sort of keep asking questions, keep checking with people. And then they can then perhaps have an opportunity to say, well, I'm not quite happy with this. And that takes a bit of courage, because none of us want to be told, that, our communication style is not what they want. But better to find out earlier rather than later, and hopefully it's a one-off generally, because if it's worked with many other people, then maybe this was just a one instant type thing, but there are things you can do about it.
Great.
Which I'll come on to, basically.
There's quite a lot of agreement. I think that's touched a nerve. I think that's other people are finding that. So I think that's all the questions. Well, actually, there is one I was recently asked that might be useful throwing in there. Is it really necessary to decide on the roles and responsibilities beforehand? Isn't that something that will just naturally evolve?
No, I think it's like with any piece of work, you need to be clear on who's doing what. It might evolve throughout the process, as in you might realize that the roles and responsibilities need to overlap more, or one person needs to do more of one thing and another thing. But it's important for everybody to be as clear as you possibly can be before you even start working, because otherwise you start assuming that somebody else is doing something that they're not doing, and it might be crucial to the project, or two people then start arguing about, sort of while the project is on as such, while the working process is on, when you've started it, they start arguing about who should be doing what. So if you're going to have those discussions, have them beforehand rather than throughout, so everybody is clear and happy to proceed like that. It might change, it might, you learn as you go along, but the more clarity you can get before you start, the better it's going to be for the actual working process.
Yeah, I have to say, I can add, in my experience, that's so true, because people then start getting upset about the split of money if suddenly someone feels they're pulling their weight more than the other, whereas if all of that gets discussed beforehand, you can renegotiate and change, but it actually really does settle things. I think that's all the questions we have at the moment, so I'll let you carry on.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and it is about, this sort of process. I'm doing the sort of prep for the process, really, which I use all the time, and it works. Because I've, in my experience, when I haven't gone through this sort of approach, then trouble will come up down the line. It might come up anyway, but at least if you're all on the same page to start off with, and you're as clear as you possibly can be to start off with, then it's going to be less trouble, basically, and you're going to be able to overcome it more easily because you know what you're all about. You know, you've agreed a structure, basically. So somebody can't suddenly say, well, we never agreed that I would write this piece. When you can say, well, actually, we did. We were all there. We've got it down in writing. So, so it just clarifies it for everybody, and it actually makes the whatever you're trying to achieve a much easier flowing process. So just going back then to resources, really important to consider resources before you start, because people come a cropper here. You might not be able to do it, know exactly what it's going to cost, but it will cost something. But as you get more experienced of your time and what goes into a particular piece of work, this will come more easily. But it's really important because there's no point in starting something if you just can't afford it. So, or as I say, you may have to raise funds for it. So this is often the case with arts projects, that you have to go and there are funding streams as such. Perhaps you actually have to, before you start, get the funding for it, or find out if it's a personal funding, then find out who is going to be paying this. It's going to be an equal contribution from each of the collaborators, and can they live up to their end of the bargain? How are you going to manage this? Say if you decide, well, you'll need at least £1,000 for the next 3 months, then are you going to open a bank account for this? And in some funding cases, for example, you have to have a bank account before you even to apply for the funding. So these sort of things are really worth checking out. And as far as finances goes, we can all come croppers with arguments about finances, etc. Somebody has got to manage those, and you would have, if you can decide beforehand who's this going to be. There's often a financial, sort of person within a group. People are really good at managing these things, but you might want to do it equally. But that's the thing to decide beforehand, rather than when you're through the process and you start saying, well, who's done this and who spent this, and I should be in charge of that, because these things can cause massive flare-ups, and we all know that money can cause things to break down completely if there's huge disagreement. So important to consider. So we're really getting to grips now with sort of this project. We're really sort of setting it up well, basically. So we know who's doing what, we know what resources we need, we know the activities, and the next thing then is to give yourself a time scale for it and make this sort of realistic but challenging, because a lot of projects don't get off the ground because people just run out of steam. They don't give themselves good deadlines or realistic deadlines. They just peter off. But the great thing about working with people is that it makes it easier to meet deadlines, because of course that you're accountable. That you've all agreed to do something within the next 2 weeks, and you're all going to meet about it in sort of 2 weeks' time or whatever, or speak about it, conference call about it, however your working is set up. So that's really motivates you to get things done. And I find that one of the huge benefits is working as a part of a team, because the accountability to other people gets you motivated and gets you to do the work, even if you stay up, till the wee small hours to do it. Sort of you need to plan your workflow. It all helps. Like you can see, for a lot of people, they think, well, this sounds very organized, it sounds very regimental, but it sort of is, because what a lot of people don't realize is that this sort of professional approach, this sort of structured approach, will really help you get things done. And then things like planning your interim deadlines, so what needs to be done, in what order. This might change a bit too, but you've got sort of smaller deadlines, so that to keep that momentum going, to keep you all going in the meanwhile, because some of these projects and some of these ideas can take weeks, months, or even years to get off the ground. So we have to find ways in our team to make sure that we keep going, and to make sure that the project itself doesn't peter out, especially if we've done lots of hard work in the meanwhile. Okay, now this is sort of one of the last things really before starting your project. It's really important to get something down in writing. You'll have heard of so many different people who've fallen out because they hadn't got things in writing. So people have been stormed off, or people have not got their just desserts because things weren't in writing. So it's important, even if it's quite a small thing you're planning, to get some clarity in this area as well. Lots of different things you can include in a contract, and your unions will advise you on this too. But some of the things might be sort of things we've been discussing already, and by now you'd have a really good idea of this. So the contract itself should be quite easy to write. So it'll be things like who's doing what, when, who owns what, really important, any assets that this idea or project is going to have. You've got to be very clear about who owns it and who's going to get it at the end. Things like, sort of by this time you should know, who's going to be doing various activities, who's spending most of their time. So you're looking at profit and payment distribution. So who's going to get what? Is it going to be a 50-50 split or a proportional split? Or is it going to be, if there's two of you working on it, it's going to be 70-30. Important to know beforehand or to agree beforehand to stop any bitterness or resentment along the way. And, you can revise these things if it turns out differently. But if you've done your estimations and you're planning well, you should have a pretty good idea of it. Other things that might come into a contract are your intellectual property rights, things like copyright and patent and logo, website, if you're going to be using a website, who would own that after the project ends, if the project is going to end, illustrations, those sort of things. And then other assets like equipment, will you have bought equipment, who will own it at the end, and even things like bylines, because if you've got a writing collaboration, maybe there's 4 of you, then is somebody going to come at the top of the top of the list of names, or who's going to get the big byline, or is it going to be equal? How are you going to work out things like that? Because that can get to be sort of incredibly annoying as well if you thought you were going to get the sort of lead spot and somebody else wants it. So best to agree beforehand, and then it's sorted then, and then and you don't even have to work with that person if you're not happy, because you're doing this now rather than trying to renegotiate halfway down the line. And other things to consider, you may or may not want to include them in a contract, but they might be sort of on a sort of checklist or whatever. But other things to consider would be things like, what happens if somebody needs time off? We all get sick at some point or another, or somebody else in our family has got sick. This does happen. What happens if somebody doesn't live up to their, deliver on their promises and fails to contribute? What are you going to do then? Things like, sort of, if somebody decides to leave because they just don't want to do it anymore, will they then still have rights to the equipment, to the IP, to profit, etc.? And this has all happened in the past. These things all happened. So if we can sort of think about them now, then hopefully it's going to stop them happening in the future. And then if you run out of resources, how are you going to divvy things up? So all these things it's like making contingency plans, really. All these things hopefully won't happen. But if they do happen, you've already thought about them, and it will save arguments, sort of through the process, or maybe if the process comes to a close. Right. Okay.
Sorry, can I jump in with a question?
Certainly can.
Raoul says, just a scenario where a creative collaboration involves profit sharing. Is there a standard time period over which the profit sharing agreement should be in place? For example, if the project under consideration is a short film or a web series pilot?
I'm not sure, actually, Rose. This is a really good question. There probably is, and you probably need to do a bit of research on this, and I think your union will be able to help you there. But I think you probably shouldn't put that as part of your contract, because we don't know how successful we're going to be. So originally it might be, seem quite fair that somebody gets 20% and somebody gets 80%. But after 6 months, you actually realise that that's not a fair split at all. So there probably should be some sort of caveat in there that, and time limit for renegotiation. But I think your union will be able to give you a little bit more specific advice on that. But I definitely think that, there should be a time limit or time span for those sort of things.
Yeah. Then we have Sam and Ella, who are sort of talking on a similar thing, talking about, Sam's talking about passive aggressions being something really hard to handle when people are trying to get out of things. And also Ella's talking about the power imbalance. And in a way, it's kind of reinforcing some of the things you've already said about getting agreements in place to deal with that. But I don't know how you would want to answer that.
Yeah, and like this is the whole point of doing your prep work, really, to see who's doing what and when and how. Because if you've agreed, for example, decision making, if there's a few different areas, if you've agreed who makes a decision in different areas, the ultimate decision, then there is no power imbalance, because you've already discussed it, you've already sorted it. This sort of prep work actually helps stop these things happening. If you haven't discussed it, you can have somebody who's quite rumbustious, very ebullient sort of person who takes over and decides that everything should be done their way. Well, that sort of person is quite difficult, almost impossible to work with. But if you haven't agreed the terms beforehand, then it's very hard to stop that, and that can be something that completely destroys a collaborative relationship, where everybody like huffs off, or somebody feels completely railroaded by that sort of person. But this is the whole point of sussing out people beforehand to see if you can actually work with them, and making proper agreements of how, so you're going to carry on with this work and who does what and when, basically, should stop that sort of thing. And passive aggression, I'm going to do a bit about this, and this tips for building a working relationship, but that can be difficult to deal with when people don't say, sort of what they're thinking. They resent what you're doing, and then they become aggressive by maybe not performing, maybe avoiding your phone calls, by being passively aggressive. Basically, it's quite difficult to deal with, but hopefully some of the tips I give you in our last section today will help with that, because communication is incredibly important in any business relationship, but also in social relationships too. So any other questions, Miriam, before I move on?
There's quite a long one here from Cindy that I was just starting to read. Something about just arranging songs written and being paid as an MD for a music project, paid a premium rate, and then was hit with giving 50% of copyright for the songs. They did have an input with refining the songs, but I feel that the rate we agreed covered that. I went along with it in discussions. I felt the time they were more knowledgeable about how this should be structured, and building a good working relationship, which became friendship, was important. Now I'm feeling hard done by, can't afford to work with the individual anymore, and don't have ownership of my songs. I've paid them for a further 3 days of their time, and I'm thinking that maybe I can get them to sign over their share of the copyright back to me for that money and bring the collaboration to an end. Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's quite a harsh lesson, basically, because the problem there started off with you thinking that they knew better, and this it is all about experience, basically, because I think we've all done this at some point or another. We think maybe a bigger organization or somebody else knows what they're talking about and we don't, but we don't. So we can learn from that experience. And this is the whole point. And we have to keep learning from what we're doing and making sure that we don't do that again, and becoming more knowledgeable. But sometimes we do have to walk away. We have to just take it. Yes, I feel hard done by, but I just have to take it on the chin, because actually there's no sort of mislegal nothing sort of illegal going on here. There was a contract. I did agree to it. In retrospect, I realized it was the wrong thing to do. So how can I move on from this? It might be that you go back to them and end the collaboration, because you have to assess what value you're getting from it now. And if you're not getting any value, then what's the point of doing it? Sometimes it's just one of those things you just have to take a hit and learn from it, but get out of it so you're not feeling resentful and bitter and twisted, because there's nothing worse than working with people that you don't respect, you don't trust anymore for whatever reason, and you don't feel that you're getting what you should be getting. That just makes you very bitter. And stops your energy for other projects and other things. So really, if weigh up the value, I would, of staying with these people. And if you really feel that you should get out away from them, then think of an approach to end that relationship, but learn from that then, so you can move on and make better decisions for yourself in future. Because what you'll do now is make sure, perhaps in future, when you're negotiating a particular contract, that you're really informed about it. The MU, if you're a musician, will give you a lot of help here, actually. So that's the lesson, really. And sometimes you just have to take a hit, unfortunately. But don't get bitter and twist about it, because there's lots of other things to be doing, and it would be a shame, to stop your creative energy just because of one instance, basically.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I know a lot of people. I've been in situations where I've sort of felt, someone's actually just taken what I've done and used it elsewhere, not in as blatant a copyright thing as that. And my attitude to make myself feel better is, well, I can think of new things. They can't. They have to use somebody else's. So that kind of helps me. Anyway, that's the end of the questions.
Yeah, great. And you can always get some advice as well, like from the MU or from your union. They've got really good departments. If you're not comfortable with, doing it on your own, then I would say get some advice. I mean, even if it's legal advice or from anywhere you can, but I would start with your unions, because it will be specific cases and they are there, to help in that instance. So don't always think you have to do it on your own, but do something about it. So that would be my advice on that. Right. Okay. So the last section then, really. So you've done all the work basically to ensure that as much as possible, you're collaborating with the right people. You've delegated the roles and responsibilities. You've got your contract as such. You know what everybody's doing. So then you start the working process. So I want to just share with you some as far as my experience, and done quite a lot of research on this, a lot of business coaching as such, and worked with a lot of teams, etc. So some of the things that you really should bear in mind, which will help you manage controversy or stop things happening that didn't really need to happen. So the first thing is communication. I always bang on about communication being key, and it is basically because any team needs regular communication. We all need to know what we're doing, and you sort of need to decide when and how you're going to do this. So maybe you always, when you're developing the idea, you always have to work together, be in the same space. But often the case is you don't. Maybe if you're writing a book or something, so you're going to be revising each other's copies, etc., etc. So maybe you don't have to see each other all the time. Maybe you're going to meet every month just to check on what's going on. Maybe you're going to use Skype or email or phone or whatever. But think about how you're going to communicate, because it will be a really important part of that process. Also, think about your communication tools. It's important you're going to be using the same sort of things, and not just tools for the work part of it, but maybe also for the, sort of keeping each other motivated part of it, because, sometimes these projects are full of challenges, and you do need to keep inspiring each other and keep in contact with each other, and things like chat apps it can be really useful for that, and team discussion boards. So think of ways you can communicate, and think of ways that make the communication where the work is involved uniform, basically. So there's nothing worse than if somebody's made a revision on a piece and you revise the old piece rather than new piece. So those sort of things are really essential, basically. Now, as I say, there are going to be arguments sometimes. We can't always all agree, but hopefully your strategy will be, so sometimes you have to agree to disagree, but also to move on. There's nothing worse, when you've had disagreements and somebody's made a final decision, if somebody's holding that, resentment or thinking, I still don't agree with that, I still don't want to do it, because that will actually affect your results. Sometimes you just have to think, okay, that wasn't my idea, that wasn't exactly what I do, but we've already agreed that somebody's going to make a final decision on this, and so I'm going to live by that decision. It's really important to focus on your ultimate goals when you're working as part of a team. So you may even want to beforehand suggest some dispute resolution sort of tactics. Maybe if you're all going to carry on with a particular thing that you're not happy about, maybe somebody outside, a third party, can help you decide objectively. So get those strategies into place, and talk about it with people beforehand. So be realistic. Look, we may disagree. So what are we going to do about it? Because everybody needs to be able to air their opinion, and nobody should feel bullied or closed down. So talk about these things openly, and the more open you can be, the better your communication, the easier it is to resolve these issues. It's not a personal thing. It's that everybody is passionate about what they're doing. Everybody has an idea. And everybody, would like their own way, but often it's not the best way for the project to continue. And what I'd say, this is talking about being passive aggressive. It's important to address problems as they come up, rather than just letting them go, because a lot of passive aggressive people don't address problems, and then they blame everybody else for not being able to read their minds. So don't assume that anybody knows anything. If you're having regular meetings, make a spot, for saying, what's going right, what's going wrong, are we having any problems, has anybody got anything to say that they're unhappy with? This is encouraging people to be honest, so things don't build up and sort of emotions are not don't flare up, causing massive confrontation, which is what we don't want and we don't need. And as creative people, often many of us have quite big egos or are very passionate about what we do. I was reading a piece about creatives before. It's not so much the ego that gets in the way, is that they're so passionate about what they do. They don't like other people changing their ideas. Now, if that's the case, if you really don't want your idea changed or any influence from other people, then perhaps you shouldn't be working in collaboration in the first place. The whole point of working as part of a team is that people can input and hopefully sharpen that idea and make it the best possible for the end delivery as such. So, think about that. If your ego is such that it's too big or too frail or too, sort of too committed to an idea that the way you want it, then maybe collaboration is not the way to go. Listening, really important. This will be, so if you're creating lots of opportunities to be able to talk to each other, then listening to all ideas is important and not dismissing them completely immediately. And when I say listen, I mean, it sounds obvious, but listening to listen to what people are really saying and not what you want them to say, or half listening and dismissing ideas. If you can explore every idea and give every idea the respect it deserves, then everybody in that team will feel much happier and feel that even if they didn't get their way, even if their idea wasn't what everybody else wanted to do, they'd actually feel that it was valuable and then be encouraged to come up with other things in the future. And then also sometimes there's lots of challenges to get over, and sometimes some of these projects can last quite a long time. So do remember, to celebrate every moment. This is meant to be enjoyable as well as, sort of sometimes pressurized. Sometimes you have to deal with a few things you didn't expect. Sometimes there's lots of, sort of different sort of obstacles thrown in your way. Creative working together with people should be a great experience. And the good thing about, sort of working with others is that it's wonderful to be able to say, look what we've achieved, we're nearly there, or we'd set ourselves a target for a month's time, we've achieved it, let's go out and have a beer, or coffee, or whatever you like to do. Make sure that you try and encourage people and enjoy it as much as you can, because there will be sort of challenges along the way. Then just to finish off really, and I'm going to do another webinar actually on sort of communication and managing client relationships. It's quite related to this, either next month or the month after, but these are just a few tips really to be getting on with. So important as part of your communication really to review what you're doing on an ongoing basis. Things might change, roles and responsibilities might change, you might change your goals even, because you realize with experience and actually doing something, it's not quite what you all originally intended. So you might go slightly off direction to get a different goal or amended goal. But important to keep assessing where you are, because this is quite motivational as well. Gosh, we've achieved this and now we need to do the next thing. So it's like trying to build and maintain momentum throughout until you've achieved those results. If you're going to miss deadlines, it does happen. Don't be one of those people, always missing deadlines, because that will really annoy everybody, especially if you've promised otherwise. But any sort of problems or things like missed deadlines, try and warn people in advance so they can adjust their schedules. We'll all have different things to do. And while we can all, forgive people for making mistakes or for, sort of not delivering sometimes, if it's a consistent thing and it's just dumped on us, that's going to cause flares up within any team. And then once the project is over, then do yourself, sort of review what's happened, what went well, what didn't go well, what you wouldn't do again. Things like with a contract that you signed that actually wasn't a good contract for you, you're not going to do that again. So how can you do that better? Do you need to take advice, legal advice or advice from your union in some way to make sure that you don't repeat mistakes? Or are you now comfortable with the fact that what went wrong and you can actually improve things in the future? Were there people that you actually loved working with or you really want to work with again? Were there people you realized that there's a massive personality clash and you just can't work with again? Because any situation that happens, like maybe somebody didn't like your communication style, then you want to be able to change that in the future to get better results. Or you might think, well, actually, I was really happy with what I did, and it's in that case, I can't work with that person again. So it's that review process is incredibly important, because you'll find with these sort of projects that experience is invaluable to take on to the next project. What you don't want to do is keep repeating the same mistakes. I think that was the definition of insanity, wasn't it? Doing the same thing, but expecting different results. So yeah, so review. So that's probably it for today. I hope that's been useful for you. I don't know if there's any more questions, Muriel.
It's not a question, but Mark has just kind of come in and sort of said that the thing about creatives in general, a dichotomy, is that some of us can be extrovert and loud and seemingly brimming with confidence, but don't like the detail. Others are shy, quiet and sensitive and don't see the overall picture. Those don't always go together, but get the point. And then when you partner with each other, it sort of seems to compensate for what the other is missing, but then the quiet one tends to get railroaded, and then the loud one can accidentally land you in problems. So really it's about communication skills and sensitivity, and it's why what he was recommending with his MLKT is so crucial. So it's really take your time before jumping in. And I also just wanted to say something on the passive aggressive thing as well. There's not really the space, and it's not really appropriate to feel bad in a business relationship. So it's a bit of a flag if someone's making you feel bad or guilty that there's some passive aggressive stuff going on. And my way of dealing with that is always to sort of not feel bad, to sort of, step back and then lay things out. And in a factual way, it can be a great way to diffuse the passive aggressive stuff. But yeah, I mean, Mark is absolutely right about relationships. I don't know if you want to say any more on that, Frances.
Yeah, it's the thing, of being, this is why it's good to get your professional head on, basically, as in, yeah, you want to have great times with people. And I certainly have great times with many of the people I've worked with, but you have to be able to be adult about it, really, and express your thoughts. And if you can create an environment originally by going through the process of, thinking about what you're going to do if there's arguments, getting it down in writing, thinking about, sort of how you're going to work together, personality types, all that sort of thing, then, so if you're not setting yourself up for a fall. If you, as Mark was saying, if you just jump straight in, then it could be anybody, and there's going to be trouble ahead, definitely, or unless you're incredibly lucky, which most of us, find that, oh God, I didn't realize this person was such a tyrant, or actually that's not what I wanted to do at all. But this is why it's important to be clear beforehand as much as you can, but also have a flexible approach. So if things change, then you communicate the changes, you communicate if there's problems. This communication is clear and it's adult, and it's encouraged, rather than if you say something to somebody, they flare up and shout you down. Well, I don't want to work with people like that, because it's not constructive. But discuss it, keep discussing it, and it takes a certain amount of courage. And even if people say, no, I don't agree, well, that's fine. You said what you think, and that always makes you feel a lot better. You can come to some agreement because you've already discussed it, how you're going to do it. Any other questions?
Great. No, there's a bit more conversation about this copyright. Clinton was saying that, from another position, someone in his band suddenly claimed copyright. So there's obviously a big topic. And then Crystal is just sort of saying that she's in a collaboration where they split things 50-50 now. Yeah, and Cindy's also coming in to comment on that giving people credit for contributions is important. The financial controlling aspect needs to be weighed, though. If and as she quite rightly says, if someone's paid handsomely for making a contribution towards the process, but then want ongoing financial benefits, it's something different, which I would agree with.
Yeah, and you have to, and this is why it's really important. Can't emphasize enough. This is why it's so important to think it through and discuss it beforehand, so you're clear about everything. But also recognize that things might change, and you may have to renegotiate. And sometimes it may be your responsibility, even though you didn't mean to get into a position that it doesn't turn out well for you. Maybe because of your lack of knowledge, or because you didn't go through the process of discussion because you thought, I just want to get on with it, can't be bothered with that. Then you won't get the results you want. And I think we've all been through that, but you learn as you get more experience. Actually, it is worth going through this process, because you'll just cut out so much potential trouble in the end as such, rather than and nobody wants to lose colleagues and friends over these sort of things, but it can happen unless unless we have this sort of clearness of thought and progress as such. So great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We hope you'll let us know if you're about your different collaborative relationships, how they're going. We've got plenty more webinars coming up this year. As I say, next one is probably going to be on developing really good working relationships and managing your clients. We've got lots of venue-based and online stuff coming up. August, we've got how not to be skint in London, which is about cash flow, managing your cash flow. So some of you might want to come along to that, and there's plenty of time to book for that, and loads of stuff online. But for now, we hope you found this a useful session. If you've got any questions, do email me. I'd love to hear from you. We'll be sending you the presentation, and it will be up online as soon as we can do it, but it'll be up online the next few days. So thank you, everybody, and have a good day and happy collaboration.
Bye.
Bye.